One of the most misunderstood subjects in the New Testament is the subject of Christian liberty. There are people who think that because a person is saved by grace and not works, then surely they can live whatever way they like. But that's simply a failure to understand the true nature of sin, which is actually bondage, and that salvation frees a person from that bondage. Now, some of the Corinthian believers seem to have got caught up with that idea, and we're going to read about it in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 12 to 15. All things are lawful unto me, but all things are not expedient. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be brought under the power of any. Meats for the belly, and the belly for meats, but God shall destroy both it and them. Now the body is not for fornication, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. And God hath both raised up the Lord, and will also raise up us by his own power. Know ye not that your bodies are the members of Christ? Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them the members of a harlot? God forbid. When Paul begins these verses with the words, all things are lawful unto me, which he repeats twice, it may be that he's actually quoting a Corinthian slogan, and possibly also quoting from the letter that they appear to have written to him, according to chapter 7, verse 1. The slogan may possibly even have been derived from Paul's own teaching. For example, Paul wrote, stand fast in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free, in Galatians chapter 5, verse 1. But like many slogans, it is only part of the picture. So Paul has to remind these Corinthians that the statement, all things are lawful unto or for me, is not open-ended, but it must be regulated by two things. The first of these is the profit or the benefit of doing the thing. He writes, but all things are not expedient in verse 12. And the second, of course, is the power of the thing that I want to do to dominate me. And again, he writes in verse 12, but I will not be brought under the power of any. Now, just because a thing can be done does not mean that it ought to be done. In a sense, what Paul is saying at the end of the verse is a play on words. All things are in my power, but I shall not be overpowered by anything. Now, it seems that the idea that all things are lawful may have been used to excuse indulgence, like the sin that Paul writes about in the first part of the chapter. But whenever Paul writes in verse 13, the body is not for fornication, but for the Lord, he wants us to be clear that our bodies are not for self-indulgence. They are for the Lord. And it is important that he uses the title Lord here. It is he who has rights over us. You see, it is true that the body may be used for sexual relations. He will deal with this in more detail actually in chapter 7. But it may not be used for sinful ones, that is fornication. Now, in verse 14, Paul shows that God has something long-term in view for the body. It was seen in the resurrection of the Lord's body. His body was not simply cremated or disposed of. And in his purpose, we'll see it for our own bodies. God hath both raised up the Lord and will also raise up us, he says in verse 14. How we use our bodies, therefore, should be informed by God's longer term purpose for them. Now, furthermore, Paul reminds us that your bodies are the members of Christ in verse 15. Someone else is involved in respect of what we do with our bodies. If that is so, and it is so, indulgently joining in an illicit relationship does violence to that membership, just as going to court did earlier in the chapter. So let us be sure that we use our own bodies in his service in the same way that the Lord Jesus did with his.